He walked into a luxury store with his dirty dog and was treated like an intruder. They said that place wasn't for people like him. But what the staff didn't know was that they were about to make the mistake of the year. Hours later, he returned, and beside him an army of lawyers made everyone understand who he really was. Subscribe now to our channel and discover how a simple farmer turned the tables with style and justice. Tuesday morning on Fifth Avenue was busy as always. The September sun in New York filtered between elegant buildings, illuminating the gleaming storefronts of the city's most exclusive boutiques. Among the hurried passers-by, dressed in designer clothes and carrying bags from international brands, one figure stood out completely from the glamorous scene. John Charles Morgan walked along the sidewalk with firm steps, his worn leather boots making a discreet sound against the polished marble. At 52, his sunburned face bore the marks of someone who spent more time outdoors than in air-conditioned offices. His faded jeans had seen better days, and his plaid cotton shirt, though clean, showed signs of much use in the slightly worn cuffs. At his side, like a faithful shadow, trotted Thunder, a medium-sized dog whose lineage mixed German Shepherd with something undefined, resulting in an animal with dark brown fur and intelligent eyes that seemed to absorb every detail of the urban environment. The animal walked with discipline, not pulling on the leash, attentive to the silent commands of his owner. John Charles stopped in front of the window of Elite Fashion, a recently opened store that promised to bring the most sophisticated European fashion to America. The minimalist decoration of the facade, all in white and gold tones, displayed an elegant discretion that screamed exclusivity. He observed the displayed items for a few moments, especially a pair of Italian leather boots that had caught his attention in a magazine advertisement. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the glass door and entered the establishment, followed by Thunder, who maintained his alert but calm posture. The interior was even more impressive than the window display. White marble floor, strategic lighting that created an almost ethereal environment, and only a few carefully selected pieces displayed on stands that looked more like works of art. The air conditioning maintained the perfect temperature, and the ambient sound, soft classical music, completed the atmosphere of refinement. Mannequins with perfect proportions displayed clothes whose prices certainly exceeded the monthly salary of most Americans. It was then that Carla Monroe noticed him. At 28, she had been hired not only for her fashion experience, but mainly for her ability to quickly identify the profile of customers. Thin, tall, with perfectly brushed blonde hair and impeccable nails, she approached with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her voice polite, but carrying an almost imperceptible coldness. Her eyes made a quick movement from John Charles's dusty boots to Thunder, and then back to his face. "Unfortunately, our store policy doesn't allow animals inside." John Charles observed her for a moment, noticing the poorly disguised discomfort in her expression. "He's my working dog," he replied simply, his deep voice carrying the Texan accent he'd never tried to hide. "And I just want to take a look at those boots in the window." Carla hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. She quickly looked at the store's other customers, two elegant women who had stopped examining a purse to discreetly observe the scene, and made a decision. "I'll call the manager, sir. Just a moment, please." Richard Sanford appeared in less than 2 minutes. At 35, he was the very image of a successful fashion executive. Perfectly tailored Italian suit, hair with just the right amount of gel, shoes that probably cost more than an economy car. He had been hired by the European headquarters of the brand specifically to raise the standard of the American branch. He evaluated John Charles from head to toe with a look that didn't bother to hide his judgment. The farmer could see in the manager's eyes the same expression he already knew well, that mixture of contempt and discomfort that certain people showed when faced with someone who didn't fit their social standards. "Sir," Richard began, adjusting his tie with a nervous gesture, "I need to explain that this establishment has a very specific code of conduct. It's not just the issue of the animal, although that is strictly prohibited for hygiene and safety reasons, regarding our luxury products." He paused, as if carefully choosing his next words. "This isn't exactly the type of environment for Well, for customers with your profile. Our products are intended for a very specific audience, and I believe you would feel more comfortable in establishments more suitable to your lifestyle. The silence that followed was almost palpable. The two customers who were observing the scene exchanged meaningful glances, and Carla lowered her eyes, clearly embarrassed, but lacking the courage to challenge her superior. John Charles remained motionless for a few seconds, absorbing not just the words but the entire context of the situation. His eyes slowly scanned the environment, the other employees who had stopped their activities to observe, the customers whispering among themselves, the security cameras that certainly recorded every second of that moment. Thunder, as if sensing the tension of the moment, moved closer to his owner, lightly pressing his head against John Charles's leg. The simple gesture seemed to convey a silent solidarity that needed no words. "I understand," the farmer finally said, his voice maintaining the same calm tone as always. There was no anger in his words, nor apparent indignation, just a serene acceptance that somehow made the situation even more uncomfortable for those watching. He bent down slightly and stroked Thunder's head, as if reassuring not only the animal but himself. "Let's go, partner," he murmured quietly. "Apparently we're not welcome here." When he stood up, he pulled the straw hat he was wearing further down, partially covering his eyes. Unhurriedly, he turned toward the door, walking with the same dignity with which he had entered. Thunder followed him, maintaining the same disciplined pace. At the door, John Charles paused for a moment and looked back, not with anger or resentment, but with an expression that Richard couldn't completely decipher. There was something in that look, a silent certainty, as if the farmer knew something that everyone else present didn't. "Have a good day," he said simply, before leaving. The door closed behind him with a soft sound, but the echo of that moment lingered in the air. The employees slowly resumed their activities, but there was a residual tension that wouldn't dissipate. Carla avoided Richard's gaze, while the two customers exchanged comments in low voices. "You did the right thing," one of the customers told Richard, approaching the counter. "These types of people don't understand the value of an establishment like this. If we start accepting just anyone, we'll soon lose our exclusivity." Richard nodded, but there was something in his expression that suggested the situation hadn't been as simple as he would have liked. There was something in that man's behavior, a calmness, a dignity, that didn't fit the stereotype he had created in his mind. Outside, John Charles walked along the sidewalk unhurriedly, observing the street's movement with his usual attention. Thunder trotted beside him, occasionally looking up as if checking his companion's state of mind. They stopped at a cafe on the corner, where John Charles ordered a simple coffee and sat at one of the outdoor tables. As he savored the drink, he observed the movement at Elite Fashion through the window. He could see Richard animatedly talking with the customers, probably boasting about how he had resolved the situation. "You know, Thunder," he said quietly, scratching behind the dog's ear, "sometimes we need to be reminded of who we really are, and sometimes we need to remind others too." Thunder tilted his head, as if perfectly understanding his owner's words. There was a complicity between man and animal at that moment that went far beyond the common relationship between a person and their pet. John Charles finished his coffee unhurriedly, paid the bill, and stood up. Before leaving, he took his cell, phone from his pocket, a simple but functional device, and made a few quick calls. His words were few but precise, and anyone who observed him carefully would notice that his posture had subtly changed. He was still the same calm person as always, but there was now a determination in his movements that wasn't there before. "At 4 in the afternoon, he said during the last call. "Yes, on 5th Avenue, the Elite Fashion store." A pause. "No, it's not a personal matter. It's a matter of principles." He put away the phone and looked once more toward the store. The afternoon sun was beginning to create different shadows on the street, and the flow of pedestrians gradually changed as the day progressed. "Let's go home, partner," he said to Thunder. "But we'll be back here later, and when we return, things will be a little different." As they walked away, none of the Elite Fashion employees could imagine that this simple man, with his worn clothes and his mixed-breed dog, was about to turn their lives upside down in a way they could never have predicted. At 4 o'clock sharp, Fifth Avenue witnessed an unusual movement. John Charles Morgan was walking again on the sidewalk of Elite Fashion, but this time his appearance was completely transformed. He wore a navy blue blazer of impeccable cut, a white dress shirt and perfectly pressed dress pants. His shoes, though discreet, were of genuine leather and shone under the New York sun. Only his sunburned face and calloused hands betrayed his true occupation. Thunder continued by his side, but now wore a professional leather collar with an official identification that characterized him as an emotional support and detection dog. The animal maintained the same disciplined posture as always, but seemed to capture the different energy of his owner. What drew the most attention, however, was the group accompanying them. 4 people walked in formation behind John Charles, all dressed with the formal rigor that only experienced lawyers know how to adopt. At the front of the group, Megan Anderson commanded the operation with the natural authority of someone who had spent the last 15 years defending discrimination cases and consumer rights. At 42, Megan was recognized as one of the best civil law specialists in New York. Her Italian leather briefcase contained documents that had been carefully prepared during the last few hours, and her determined look left no doubts about her intentions. Beside her, Robert Carter, a specialist in commercial law, mentally reviewed the articles of the Consumer Protection Act that would be relevant to the case. His 38 years of career had taught him that the most important battles were won with meticulous preparation and precise strategy. Completing the group, Patricia Smith, a young lawyer specializing in human rights, carried a tablet with recordings and digital documents, while Dr. Henry Morris, a veteran in litigation against large corporations, maintained his characteristic serious expression. When the group approached the entrance of Elite Fashion, some pedestrians stopped to observe. There was something in the posture of those people that suggested something important was about to happen. Inside the store, Carla was the first to notice them through the window. Her face instantly paled when she recognized John Charles, now unrecognizable in his formal clothes. "Richard," she called, her voice trembling slightly. "That man from this morning, he's back." Richard was at the back of the store, organizing some pieces that had arrived from Europe that morning. When he looked toward the entrance, he felt his stomach contract. The man he had dismissed hours earlier was there, but completely transformed. And he wasn't alone. "Good afternoon," said John Charles upon entering, his voice maintaining the same calm tone as always, but now carrying an authority that wasn't present in the morning. "I'd like to speak with the manager, please." Megan. Anderson stepped forward, introducing herself with the formal protocol that the situation required. "Good afternoon. I am Megan Anderson, attorney specializing in consumer rights. These are my colleagues Robert Carter, Patricia Smith, and Dr. Henry Morris." The silence that settled in the store was absolute. The few customers present completely stopped their activities, realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Carla remained motionless behind the counter, while other employees emerged from the back of the store, attracted by the palpable tension in the environment. Richard approached slowly, his face having completely lost its color. The arrogant confidence of the morning had evaporated, replaced by a growing anxiety that he tried unsuccessfully to disguise. "We are here," continued Megan, removing some documents from her briefcase, "to address a serious violation of the Consumer Protection Act, specifically sections that deal with abusive practices and discrimination in customer service." Robert Carter stepped forward, his professional voice echoing in the silent environment. "Additionally, we have evidence of discrimination based on physical appearance and social class, which constitutes a violation of the constitutional principles of equality and human dignity." Patricia Smith activated her tablet, showing the screen to Richard. "We have here the audio recording of the conversation that took place at 10:47 this morning, where the discrimination practiced by this establishment is clear." The manager looked at the screen, then at John Charles, and finally at the lawyers. His hands began to tremble slightly as he tried to process the situation. "I don't understand. There must have been some misunderstanding," There was no misunderstanding, interrupted Dr. Henry Morris, his voice carrying the authority of decades of legal experience. There was clear and documented discrimination. You specifically stated that this was not an appropriate environment for customers with our client's profile. John Charles remained calm beside his lawyers, observing everyone's reactions in the store. Thunder, as always, stayed close to him, but now his presence seemed to have a completely different meaning for everyone present. Megan resumed, speaking, removing more documents from her briefcase. Our client, Mr. John Charles Morgan, wishes to file a formal complaint not only for the discrimination suffered, but also for the public embarrassment to which he was subjected. In addition, we demand an official public retraction from the company. It was then that Carla, who had remained silent until that moment, found the courage to speak. I'm sorry. I didn't know that. Her voice failed, and she looked at John Charles with an expression of genuine regret. Ignorance doesn't justify discrimination, Patricia Smith said gently but firmly. What happened here this morning was a clear violation of the basic rights of any American citizen. Richard tried to regain some control of the situation. Look, if there was any misunderstanding, we can resolve this in a friendly manner. Perhaps a special discount or... This isn't about discounts, interrupted Robert Carter. It's about principles. It's about how an international company treats American citizens on American soil. It was at this moment that Dr. Henry Morris revealed information that would completely change the course of the conversation. By the way, there's something you should know about our client. He made a dramatic pause, observing the anxious expressions of everyone in the store. Mr. John Charles Morgan is not just an ordinary farmer. He is the owner of Lone Star Ranch, one of the largest certified organic cotton producers in the United States. His products are exported to various European countries, and he made another significant pause. Supply raw materials for several international fashion brands. The impact of this revelation was immediate. Richard felt his legs weaken and had to lean on the counter to avoid staggering. Carla brought her hand to her mouth, stifling a cry of surprise. Megan continued the revelation, now with a slight smile on her lips. In fact, if you check your own company's documentation, you'll discover that Lone Star Ranch is one of Elite Fashion's certified suppliers. The organic cotton used in this season's pieces was grown on Mr. Morgan's land. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard alternately looked at John Charles and at the documents that Megan had placed on the counter, as if he couldn't process the information. John Charles finally spoke, his voice maintaining the same calm tone as always. Thunder here, he said, scratching behind the dog's ear, isn't just my companion. He's trained to detect pests in cotton plantations. He's one of the best agricultural pest detection dogs in the country. Patricia Smith added, furthermore, Thunder is officially registered as Mr. Morgan's emotional support dog, who suffers from diagnosed social anxiety, resulting from years of facing exactly the kind of prejudice you demonstrated today. The revelation hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. Not only had he discriminated against a customer, but he had discriminated against one of his own company's suppliers. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone in the store. One of the customers who had witnessed the morning scene approached slowly. I was here this morning, she said hesitantly. I supported what he did, she pointed to Richard. I said he had done the right thing. Her voice was laden with shame. John Charles looked at her kindly. You don't need to apologize to me, Ma'am. We all make judgments based on appearances. The important thing is that we learn from our mistakes. Robert Carter returned to the legal matter. Now about the measures that must be taken. First, an official public retraction. Second, a training program for all employees about non-discriminatory service. Third, an educational campaign about diversity and inclusion. Dr. Henry added, and naturally, compensation for the moral damages suffered by our client, which will be donated entirely to institutions that work with social inclusion. Richard finally found his voice, although it came out as a hoarse whisper. I didn't know. If I had known who you were. That's exactly the problem. interrupted John Charles, his voice still calm, but now carrying a deep wisdom. Respect shouldn't depend on who I am or what I own. It should be offered to any person who enters this store, regardless of their clothes or appearance. Megan put the documents back in her briefcase, satisfied with the direction the situation had taken. We have until Friday to receive a formal settlement proposal. Otherwise, we will proceed with the appropriate legal measures. As the group prepared to leave, John Charles stopped and looked directly at Richard. "Young man," he said, "I hope you learn something from this. It's not the shine of the shoe that shows a person's character, but how they treat those they consider different from themselves." As they left the store, the lawyers talked among themselves about the next steps. But John Charles walked in, silence thunder by his side. There was a silent satisfaction in his expression, not of revenge but of justice being served. The next morning, the story had already spread like wildfire through social media. Betty Oliver, a journalist specializing in consumer rights for the New York Today portal, was one of the first to arrive at Elite Fashion with her camera and recorder. At 35, she had developed a special nose for stories that touched Americans' hearts and exposed the social inequalities of the country. "It's unbelievable," she murmured as she interviewed pedestrians on Fifth Avenue, one of the brand's largest suppliers being humiliated at the door of the store that sells products made with his raw material. The case had gained dimensions that not even Megan Anderson had anticipated. The hashtag #RespectHasNoClass was among the most discussed topics on Twitter, and videos supporting John Charles began to appear from all corners of America. Inside Elite Fashion, Richard Sanford was experiencing the worst day of his career. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. There were journalists, supervisors from the European headquarters, and even customers canceling purchases. Carla had arrived earlier that morning, but her red eyes betrayed a sleepless night. "Richard," she said hesitantly, "there's a news team at the door." And the phone won't stop ringing. It was then that the call Richard feared most came through. Alexander Martin, director of the Italian headquarters of Elite Fashion, was on the other end of the line, and his voice carried all the fury of an executive seeing his brand being destroyed in real time. "Sanford," the voice echoed through the speakerphone, "do you have any idea of the damage you've caused? Our press office in Europe has been putting out fires since last night. The story has reached international newspapers." Richard swallowed hard. "Mr. Martin, I can explain." "Explain what?" "That you publicly humiliated one of our own suppliers, that you transformed our brand into a symbol of elitism and prejudice." The director's voice rose in tone. "I'm flying to New York today, and when I arrive, you're going to explain to me personally how you plan to fix this catastrophe." Meanwhile, at Lone Star Ranch, 300 miles from New York, John Charles was in his usual morning routine. He had woken up at 5 in the morning, as always, and was walking through the cotton fields accompanied by Thunder and 2 other detection dogs. His cell phone rang incessantly, but he had decided to ignore the press calls for now. It was Megan Anderson who finally managed to speak with him. "John Charles," she said, her voice mixing excitement and concern, "you need to see what's happening. The story has become a national phenomenon." "I imagined this might happen," he responded calmly. "Watching Thunder sniff a row of cotton plants. That's exactly why I planned everything this way." The revelation caught Megan by surprise. "What do you mean, planned?" John Charles chuckled softly. "Megan, do you think it was a coincidence that I returned exactly 4 hours later with a complete team of lawyers? Do you think it was luck that I dressed appropriately and had all the necessary documents?" There was silence on the other end of the line before Megan asked, "How long had you been waiting for this?" 6 months, replied John Charles, stopping to examine a plant. "Since I learned that Elite Fashion had opened a store in New York and was using my cotton. I knew that sooner or later I would face the same prejudice as always. So I decided that when it happened, it would be in the right way." The lawyer was impressed by her client's strategy. "You orchestrated all this?" "Not exactly orchestrated," he corrected. "I prepared myself. There's a difference. The prejudice would happen anyway. It always does. I just made sure that when it happened, I would be ready to transform a humiliation into an opportunity for change." That afternoon, an unexpected event would again change the course of the story. Alexander Martin arrived in the United States and, instead of going directly to the store, decided to do something no one expected. He headed to Lone Star Ranch. John Charles was in the ranch office, a simple but organized environment with walls decorated with environmental certifications and photos of cotton fields, when the Italian executive's luxury car parked in front of the main house. Martin got out of the vehicle wearing an impeccable suit, but as soon as his Italian shoes touched the red Texas soil, he realized he was in unfamiliar territory. Thunder barked once, but John Charles reassured him with a gesture. "Mr. Morgan?" asked Martin in English with a slight Italian accent. "I am Alexander Martin, Director of Elite Fashion Europe." "Welcome to my home," replied John Charles, extending his hand with the same simplicity as always. "Would you like some coffee?" During the next 2 hours, something extraordinary happened. Martin, who had arrived prepared to negotiate a corporate solution to the problem, found himself immersed in a conversation that would change his perspective on business, values, and purpose. John Charles showed him the fields, explained the organic cultivation process, introduced him to the ranch workers, all treated with dignity and receiving fair wages, and talked about his philosophy of life. "You know, Alexander," said John Charles as they walked between the rows of cotton, "when I started supplying European brands, I knew you sold my products for 100 times what you paid me. And I never cared about that because I understand that everyone has their role in the chain." Martin listened attentively, intrigued by the wisdom of this simple man. "But what bothers me," continued John Charles, "is when this same chain that benefits from my work treats me as if I weren't worthy of being in your establishments. It's as if you want to use what I produce, but don't want to recognize me as a person." The Italian executive stopped walking, impacted by the depth of those words. I had never thought of it that way." It was then that John Charles revealed something that would change everything. "Alexander, I don't want to destroy your brand, I want to help it be better. I want Elite Fashion to be an example of how a global company can respond when it makes mistakes." 3 days later, something unprecedented happened in the history of American luxury retail. Elite Fashion organized a public event in the Fifth Avenue store itself, but this time the doors were open to everyone. The event was broadcast live on social media and was attended by influencers, journalists, and most importantly, representatives from various social classes. Alexander Martin went up on a small stage set up in the center of the store, next to John Charles, who was again wearing his usual clothes, jeans, plaid shirt, and leather boots. Thunder was at his side wearing his official working dog collar. "My friends," Martin began in still hesitant English, "I came to America to solve a problem, but I discovered that I actually came here to learn a lesson." The audience, composed of about 200 people of all ages and social classes, listened attentively. "Mr. John Charles taught me that a brand is defined not only by the products it sells, but by how it treats people. And Elite Fashion failed miserably in that aspect." Martin paused, clearly emotional. "That's why I'm here to publicly apologize not only to Mr. Morgan, but to all Americans who have ever been judged by their appearance or social condition." It was then that John Charles asked to speak. The auditorium fell into absolute silence as he approached the microphone. "I'm not a man of many words," he began, his voice echoing softly through the environment. "But I've learned in life that sometimes we need to speak so that others can hear." He looked at the audience, his eyes scanning faces of all ages. "What happened here wasn't about me. It was about all of us. It was about how we treat people. We consider different, whether because of the clothes they wear, the car they drive, or the place they were born." Thunder moved closer to him, as he always did in important moments. John Charles stroked the animal's head before continuing. "I could have reacted with anger when I was humiliated here. I could have sought revenge. But anger only generates more anger, and revenge only perpetuates the cycle of injustice." His voice was laden with contained emotion that deeply touched everyone in the audience. "Instead, I chose to use this moment as an opportunity to show that when we are treated with disrespect, we can respond with dignity. When they judge us by appearance, we can show our character, and when they try to diminish us, we can grow. In the audience, there were tears in many eyes. A grey-haired lady in the first row discreetly wiped her face, clearly touched by the farmer's words. "It's not the shine of the shoe that shows who you are," he said, repeating the phrase that would become iconic, "but the firmness of your steps." And today, we all took firm steps toward a more just and respectful world. The silence that followed was broken by applause that started timidly, but transformed into a standing ovation. People were openly crying, and even Martin was visibly moved. But the biggest surprise came when Carla Monroe took the stage. The former store employee, who had lost her job after the incident, asked to speak. "Mr. Morgan," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I want to ask forgiveness not only for what happened, but for all the times in my life that I judged people by their appearance. You taught me that true luxury is not in the clothes we wear, but in how we treat each other." John Charles approached her and, to everyone's surprise, offered her a hug. "Carla, we all deserve a second chance. The important thing is that we learn from our mistakes." It was then that Martin made an announcement that no one expected. Starting today, Elite Fashion America will initiate the Dignity and Respect program, which will include training for all employees, partnerships with small rural producers like Mr. Morgan, and a special line of clothes made exclusively with cotton from Lone Star Ranch. The event became a landmark in the history of American retail. In the months that followed, other brands began to implement similar programs, and John Charles's story inspired changes in various sectors of the economy. 6 months later, John Charles was invited to give a speech at the Capitol about social inclusion and human dignity. Thunder, as always, was by his side when he took the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice echoing in the chamber, "I am just a simple farmer from Texas. But I have learned that the true wealth of a nation is not in its GDP or exports. It's in how its citizens treat each other." The story of John Charles and Thunder became a symbol of peaceful resistance and social transformation. Schools began to use the case as an example in citizenship classes, and the farmer received invitations to speak at universities across the country. But for John Charles, the greatest victory was not the awards or recognition. It was knowing that his experience had planted seeds of change that would continue to germinate long after his story was forgotten. At the ranch, he continued his simple routine, waking up early, tending to the crops, playing with Thunder, and talking with the employees. But now he knew that each act of dignity, no matter how small, could inspire transformations greater than he had ever imagined. And so, what began as a humiliation in a luxury store transformed into a silent revolution of values, proving that sometimes the greatest changes begin with the simplest gestures from those who refuse to accept injustice as normal. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of John Charles, Thunder, and all the characters who were part of this journey has touched your hearts as it touched ours. This story reminds us that true elegance is not in the clothes we wear, but in how we treat our fellow human beings. If you were moved by this narrative of transformation and dignity, we invite you to subscribe to our channel to follow other equally inspiring stories that we bring daily. Leave your like on this video, and most importantly, share in the comments your own experiences about respect, dignity, and how small gestures can generate big changes. You are a fundamental part of this community that believes in the transformative power of good stories. Don't miss our upcoming content. We have a special playlist with narratives that celebrate the strength of human character waiting for you. Until the next story, and remember, it's not the shine of your shoes that shows who you are, but the firmness of your steps